Hello and welcome to another video in my Fundamentals of Orchestration series. I've spent a lot of time discussing orchestral strings and how to arrange for strings, and I'm certainly not finished talking about them, but I'd like to spend a bit of time looking at the orchestral woodwind family. In this video, I'll introduce the orchestral woodwind section and explore the flute family in some detail. I'll discuss the oboes, clarinets, and bassoons in upcoming videos. For each family of winds, I'll discuss range, timbre, technique, and idiomatic writing. I'll be demonstrating these instruments with orchestral woodwind sample libraries from Orchestral Tools. Let's get started. There are many types of orchestras around the world and throughout history, but I'll be focusing on the traditional classical orchestra, which has its origins in Western Europe several hundred years ago. The size and configuration of the symphony orchestra has evolved over time, but typically the woodwind section of the orchestra has contained some combination or subset of flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons. Although the use of woodwinds in ensembles goes back much further, I'll start with the woodwind section of the Baroque orchestra. Johann Sebastian Bach's Brandenburg concertos from around 1721 are some of the most important works of this time that feature woodwinds alongside strings and brass. The first concerto in F major features 3 oboes and a bassoon, while others feature recorders and flutes. I'm sure Bach was influenced by other composers at the time, as well as musicians who performed in ensembles featuring these instruments, but it's easy to see just how innovative these works were for the time, and how these pieces in particular helped shape the orchestral woodwind section over the next 100 years. During the classical era, the use of woodwinds in the orchestra became a bit more standardized, and the number of woodwind instruments in a typical symphony or large ensemble work expanded. Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, written in 1788, contained 1 flute, 2 oboes, and 2 bassoons. Haydn's Oxford Symphony, composed in 1789, had a similar instrumentation, and his London Symphony, composed in 1795, included 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, and 2 bassoons. We start to see even groupings of woodwinds during this time, a trend that continues to this day. Often when listing the instrumentation for a work, you'll hear woodwinds in pairs, which everyone agrees to mean 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, and 2 bassoons. Many symphonies and large orchestral works in the 19th century feature a similar arrangement of woodwinds. But during this time, we also start to see expansion in size and instrument type. Early Romantic-era symphonic works featured multiple instruments within the same subfamily of winds. For instance, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony featured a piccolo and contrabassoon in the 4th movement, as well as multiple versions of the clarinet, including the B-flat and A clarinets. During the late 19th century, the size of the section continued to increase. Wagner's Parsifal included 3 flutes, 3 oboes, an English horn, 3 clarinets, a bass clarinet, 3 bassoons, and a contrabassoon. Mahler's First Symphony used 4 flutes, 4 oboes, 4 clarinets, and 3 bassoons, with various doublings among those sections, including piccolo, English horn, E-flat clarinet, and contrabassoon. The 20th century woodwind section saw much more variation throughout, with some composers continuing the late Romantic trend of 4 winds on a part, while some composers aimed for a smaller, more intimate sound. Holst's The Planets, composed between 1914 and 1916, featured 4 flutes, with piccolo and alto flute doubles, 4 oboes, with the 3rd doubling bass oboe, and the 4th playing English horn, 4 clarinets with the 4th on bass, and 4 bassoons with the 4th on contra. 3 winds on a part with standard doubles, piccolo, English horn, bass clarinet, contrabassoon, as seen in Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra, became somewhat of a standard instrumentation throughout the 20th century, although many composers experimented greatly with these numbers. Some composers and orchestras opted for a more intimate sound in the form of a chamber orchestra. The original orchestration of Copland's Appalachian Spring featured just 1 flute, 1 clarinet, and 1 bassoon. Britten's chamber opera, The Turn of the Screw, featured 1 flute, 1 oboe, 1 clarinet, and 1 bassoon, with piccolo, alto flute, English horn, and bass clarinet doubles. Modern orchestral compositions typically feature either 2 or 3 on a part, and in general, the larger the instrumentation, the more expensive it is to get performed. This is also the standard size for many film scores in the second half of the 20th century, including scores by composers like John Williams or Jerry Goldsmith. Of course, there are fewer rules and limitations with film, especially in the modern era. Let's take a look at the individual families within the woodwind section, starting with flutes, which include from highest to lowest the piccolo, the concert flute, the alto flute, and the bass flute. The flute family are edge-blown aerophones and are the only reedless orchestral wind instruments. Orchestral flutes are traverse flutes, meaning the instrument is held horizontally and air is blown through the embouchure hole. This is different from other wind instruments and also differentiates orchestral flutes from recorders, tin whistles, and other end-blown flutes. Flutes are generally constructed from either wood or metal and vary in size from the piccolo, about 12 inches or 30 centimeters, to the bass flute, about 57 inches or 146 centimeters in length. There are, of course, other types of flutes, including contrabass flute, contralto flute, and even subcontrabass flute. However, these are all extremely rare, and very few of them even exist in the world. I'll focus on the more common members of the flute family, starting with the concert flute. The concert flute, tuned in C, has a range from C4 to C7, although many concert flutes can play the B just below middle C, and many modern flute players can play notes higher than C7. In general, notes above A6 are harder to produce, and C7 in particular is difficult to play with anything other than a forte dynamic. These extremely high notes should be approached by step if possible, and larger leaps up to them are ill-advised. As I mentioned in a previous video in this series, the flute has several parts of its range, each with a slightly different timbre and dynamic profile. From the lowest note to about G4, the flute is weaker in volume, but has a velvety quality that is beautiful in solo passages or extremely thin orchestral textures. From roughly G4 to G5, an octave above, the flute has a slightly thinner, more gentle sound, and notes in this range, specifically notes below C5, tend to be overpowered by anything other than thin or soft textures. The octave above this is more piercing and can cut through denser orchestral textures with ease. And as I already mentioned, the extremely high notes are powerful but not as controlled. The concert flute is known for its virtuosic agility and fluidity throughout its range, especially in the middle to high registers. It is capable of playing extremely quick passages with both slurred and tongued articulations, either scalar or chromatic, or using large leaps. Besides the standard articulations that every woodwind is capable of, legato, staccato, tenuto, accented, the flute is great for double and triple tonguing, as well as trills and tremolos. Extended techniques for flute include harmonics, flutter tongue, multiphonics, jet whistle, tongue rams, breath tones, wind noises, overblown, and many more. Most of these extended techniques are rarely used in orchestral writing, and not all professional flute players will be familiar or comfortable using these techniques. In general, you'd want to make sure that the players you're writing for are able to perform each technique before incorporating them into your composition or arrangement. I'll be going over woodwind extended techniques in a future video. The next most common member of the flute family is the piccolo, with a range from D5 to C8. The piccolo's music is written an octave lower than it sounds on the treble clef. Its range can similarly be divided into several parts, each with a distinct timbral quality. From D5 to G5, the piccolo is very quiet and hollow sounding, almost recorder-like in timbre. The next octave is soft and relatively thin, but lyrical and expressive. This is followed by the clear and bright upper range, with the highest notes being extremely powerful and piercing. The piccolo is equally capable of fast and agile passages, and has similar limitations to the concert flute in its lowest range. Only very exposed low piccolo writing will ever be heard, so most of the orchestral piccolo writing is above the treble clef staff. The piccolo is capable of the standard articulations and techniques. Extended techniques are possible, but not recommended for orchestral writing. The next member of the flute family that I'll discuss is the alto flute, tuned in G, with a range from written C4 to C7. The alto flute sounds a fourth lower, so the sounding range is from G3 to G6. The lowest octave is very warm, rich, and full-bodied. Although the alto flute is capable of a very full sound down in this range, it will still be overpowered by the rest of the orchestra unless presented against a thin texture at low dynamics. The middle register is also quite nice and full sounding, while the highest octave is somewhat weaker and ineffective. In this excerpt, you can start to hear the alto flute timbre thinning as it ascends into its highest register. Like the concert flute and piccolo, the alto flute is capable of the same standard articulations and can be fairly agile, though perhaps not as agile as the higher-pitched flutes. The larger the flute, the longer it takes the instrument to respond to the performer, especially in its lowest range, which makes extremely fast passages on alto flute, and even more so bass flute, more difficult. Also, the larger the instrument, the more breath support required. It's a good idea to include more time to breathe between phrases when writing for these instruments. The bass flute, which sounds an octave lower than written, has a written range from C4 to C7, therefore a sounding range of C3 to C6. Though it's called the bass flute, it is more of a tenor range and is most effective in the lowest octave or two, with an extremely rich and warm sound. Listen how the timbre changes as the music gets higher in its register, going from dark and full to thinner and slightly less controlled. Very few orchestras will have a regular bass flute player, so I can only recommend writing for the bass flute if you happen to know the player or ensemble, or you're writing for sample libraries. That's all for this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. Next up will be the oboes, then clarinets, then bassoons. After that, I'll dive into orchestrating melodies, accompaniments, and woodwind textures, as well as orchestrating music for woodwinds and strings together. See you next time.